Hey, so as I said, we are starting a new series called Rediscovering Awe, and this series came it's probably a few months ago. God had really brought this series to my mind, and I think the reason he did that is because I began in my own life to go through a process of rediscovering the awe of God in my life. And I know if you're like me, which we're all human in the same way, we share this tendency that, when we're little kids, we're in awe a lot, aren't we? I mean, you just look around little kids and their mouths are open and their eyes are big and you can see the awe of God. But one of the problems is when we get older and when life gets busy, when life gets monotonous, sometimes we begin to lose the awe of God that God had designed us to have. Have you guys ever done that before? You know what I'm talking about? I realized this. So one of the routines in my family, we have a bedtime routine. And we have four, if you don't know our family, we have 4 little kids. And so we have this little thing, they got to go put on their clothes, they need to go brush their teeth, and then go meet us in their bed. And then we make the circuit. We visit each child, and I say, hey, how you doing? How was your day? Do you have anything that I can pray for you? And then I pray with my kids. I give them a kiss, and I tuck them in, and then we leave. And sometimes they actually stay in their room. But the neat thing, if you think about that, I know some of you who've had kids, you've had kind of a similar routine. Do you ever stop and think what a powerful thing that is that's happening in those bedtime routines? To come with your child and then to hear their needs and to pray to God in heaven on their behalf in their presence it's really an awesome moment. It truly is. But one of the things that I'm so guilty of when my life gets going so fast and then nighttime comes and I'm so tired, this beautiful moment simply becomes a routine. And I listen for a second, but I'm not really listening. And then I just pray this quick prayer to get it over with, just because I just want to be done, right? And we just have I have a tendency to lose the awe of God that I was designed to have. And God really reminded me, you know what? You need to find an awe of God again, because if you don't, you're going to die. I found this quote, and I love, let me move this a second. This is a quote from a non-Christian guy, but it's a very true quote, a guy named Albert Einstein. And I studied math and physics in college, so I love, Albert Einstein was amazing to me. I love to study him, but he was a gentleman who he probed the mysteries of the universe. He studied, he pondered, he tried to figure out how the pieces went together in equations and all sorts of things. But even as brilliant as he was able to say this, and he's so right. He says, he who can no longer pause to wonder and stand in awe is as good as dead. And his eyes are closed. And he's right. When the awe of God disappears from our lives, like the liveliness of life, the joy of life tends to disappear as well. The scriptures actually tell us we need to stand in awe. Psalm 33:8, let the whole world fear the Lord and let everyone stand in awe of him. So here's a question. As I was getting to this point, like I like to do in series, I wanted to sit down and try to define this emotion that we call awe. It's a very interesting emotion to try to define. In fact, as you read all sorts of perspectives, some from psychology, some from theology, you find such a broad realm, it's really hard to nail down a definition. And the reason for that is, think about it. Awe brings forth so many different reactions inside of us. And so maybe the best way to think about awe is to start here. When you came in, you may have started thinking about it because you found a paper on your seat. But for a moment, I want you to just take yourself back, and I want you to think about an experience of awe that you can remember. Just take yourself back. Try to visualize that moment, and then just think about what it felt like. Often moments of awe are very vivid as we think about them, I was thinking about moments of awe in my life, and when I sat there and just got quiet and started listening, I had all these moments come to mind. But with each moment, there were very vivid moments. I remember so I grew up in Michigan, which is a beautiful place, and my wife grew up here, and we found each other in Denver, and we moved here. And we had planned a trip to drive from Central, where we are, California, to Southern California. And I had never seen the glory of the coastline. And so we drove, she took me down, we took Highway 1 all the way from here to Southern California. How many of you have done that before? It is one of the most spectacular drives. But you know what? Here's what awe does, right? I was such a mess as I was looking around that I had to stop driving for our safety so that Amanda could drive. Because awe kind of takes you over in that way, Here's another one, and this is going to be one that perhaps only Doug understands, or maybe another math major understands. But when I was in college and I was studying math and I had this huge love of math, I know, this is going to be weird to most of you. That's okay. I can remember sitting, I was in a lecture, and we were proving things. We were writing proofs, and I was in calculus, which is my favorite subject in the world. And using calculus, which is basically you chop things into infinite pieces and then you add them up in this kind of bizarre way. But I remember when we sat there and we proved what the formula for the area of a circle was by calculus. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This pi r squared actually came from mathematics, and it can be proven, and it can be discovered. And then when I look at math, I see all these complicated motions in our universe can be so many times brought down to very simple formulas. And you can see just the beauty of the universe in a handful of numbers and equations. Think about this. How many of you have heard of E equal mc squared, right? It's Einstein's formula. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. That is so profound, and it's only E equals mc squared. But you have to understand, for him to get to that point, he did pages and pages of huge formulas, but it all then comes down to this little beautiful equation that God himself, when he created the heavens, embedded into creation itself. It's absolutely amazing. Another one for me, maybe more of you can relate to this one than the last one, but I remember when my first child was born, that moment was so powerful to me. I was trembling. You know that feeling? It was not safe for me to pick up that child because I might drop that child. Just how your body. You guys know that feeling I'm talking about? The trembling feeling. Okay. And maybe here's one last one. Another example. I remember that after I had come to, I grew up in the church, which is a wonderful gift, and I thank my parents for all they've done for me. But I learned about Jesus, but I didn't really choose to give my life fully to Jesus and to follow him until I got to college. And when I was learning and growing in college, I went back to my home church, and we just sang all these old hymns from when I was a little kid. But the thing about it, I just had tears just pouring down my face as we were singing, just thinking about the grace of God and the love of God and the majesty of God, and I really couldn't control it. And it was just this beautiful moment of being in awe of God. And there's so many ways, right, as we think about our experiences that we can describe how awe feels. Sometimes, like I said, there's a trembling. Sometimes it feels like time itself stands still and everything else seems to melt away. Sometimes in a moment of awe, there's a feeling where you feel smaller and you realize that there's something so much larger and more beautiful. Sometimes there's a fear, right, in the presence of something overpowering, yet in the fear, you're not afraid, and you're drawn to it. There's wonder and fascination and a desire for more. Sometimes it's just the sense of just respect and reverence. And so perhaps I thought maybe the first way and the best way to find it is simply with this picture that you have up there. Isn't this a cool picture? You guys like that? Yeah, kind of. Okay, this is a cool picture, whether you say it or not. I just love this picture, man. This is somebody in awe, isn't it? You see, her mouth is open, her eyes are wide, her eyebrows are up, and I just wonder, what is she looking at, right? But this is the picture of awe, and you get to see it every week up there. I saw this the other day. My wife and I took our kids, or the two girls, Piper and Ruby, to Disney on Ice, and we saw Frozen in the Stockton Theater. It's really cool. I went in the food line because everybody was hungry, right? I mean, starving, and Amanda went to the show. Of course, whenever you go somewhere like that, what happens to the food line? They run out of the food, you wait forever, and then you're late to the show. And so I was late to the show, but I had finally got all this food, and everybody was apparently starving before the show. But I walk in, and the two girls are just like, they cannot believe that Elsa and Anna are on ice skates, and the Frozen story is happening right before them. We give them the food, and mind you, they were starving. Ever watch a kid in awe try and eat food at the same time? Just this little chicken nugget thing. It was like it would come to the mouth, they would half chew it, hanging in their mouth. The other girl just held the pretzel. Like, I thought you were hungry. But awe has this amazing way of making time seem to stand still. And so what I've done for you today, I have made a definition, and we'll see how great my definition is. But this is how I put it down. Awe is that moment when your clock stops and you are overwhelmed by a mixture of fear and wonder. Fear because you're in the presence of something mysterious and overwhelming and overpowering, yet at the same time there's wonder, right? When you're in awe, you're drawn to it. You want to know more. You want to feel more. So this is how I define awe. If you can find a better definition, you can email me, but I'm going to stick to mine anyways. But when you think about awe, right, it's actually pretty amazing that we can experience this as human beings. And when God made each of us, think about this. When he made us, he gave us this amazing capacity to take in creation and to actually be in awe. I mean, think about it. Think about hearing itself. The fact that you can hear my voice is because there are vibrations traveling through the air that are hitting your eardrum and vibrating your eardrum, okay? And somehow your brain can interpret those vibrations and you can hear me speak and you can understand me. With your ears, you can hear, you can tell the difference between what is just noise and clanging, or you can tell the difference between like a beautiful symphony, right? And so even with your ears, you can take in the beautiful things that God has made possible. Think about your eyes. The only reason you can see shapes and textures and colors is because there is light coming out of places in this room. It's bouncing off everything in this room, and it's sending off wavelengths that your eyes can interpret and understand. Your eyes can also, as they see things, they can interpret, right? Your brain can say, that is something beautiful, that is something not so beautiful, like Joe's beard that's coming off this Wednesday. Yes. All right. So, I mean, you can think about it. You can touch, you can feel hot and cold, you can taste all these things that God has given you so that you could take in the beauty of God. He's created you to do this. Now, one of the questions that we're going to be addressing in our series as we look in the next 6 weeks is, why does God give us this amazing capacity to be in awe of him? And as we start this week, I want to take you to, I was thinking, there's this wonderful text and a wonderful story about the disciples when they were with Jesus, and they experienced literally one of the most awesome moments, truly, I think they experienced in their earthly life with Jesus. And it's a text called the Transfiguration. I want to take you there a second. It's Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. And let's read it together. Here we go. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up on a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And if you look in some of the other versions of this story, the stories also say in the other Gospels is that Jesus' face shone like the sun. So it was a pretty amazing moment. And as this was going on, there appeared before him Elijah and Moses, essentially prophets from the Old Testament, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And he didn't know what to say because they were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except for Jesus. Just as you look at this story, right, you can see awe over the story, right? You see a fear that's come over the disciples, right? And in their fear, this is probably what I would do. Peter didn't know what to say, right? So he just blurted something out. He's like, "Oh, no, we should build shelters and stay here for a while." Why? Because in the fear of it, what do you want? Peter was also like, "But this is so good. Like, let's stay here a while. Let's keep doing this. I want more of this." So they had this incredible, incredible experience of awe. But then in the story, imagine what this would have been like. All of this glory, all of this beauty, and in a moment, what happens? Just stops. And the scripture said that they were alone with Jesus. Just imagine that. If you were one of those 3 disciples, James, John, and Peter, do you think you would have been changed in this moment? Absolutely, right? I mean, I can't imagine how you couldn't be changed after you've encountered something as awesome as that. What's very interesting, though, I was thinking, how exactly were they changed? This story, if you look in the Gospel of Mark and the other Gospels as well, the Transfiguration, has a wider context in the flow of the narrative of Jesus. And before this awesome moment happens, there's another moment that you might know if you know the Bible. Maybe you don't know it, that's fine too. Jesus called a meeting with the disciples, and he got them together. He's been ministering for a while. He's been doing miracles. He's been proclaiming the truth of God. So, he's done some pretty great things. He gathers them together. He says, "All right, guys, let's talk. All right, who do the people say that I am?" And the disciples say, "Well, you know what everyone's saying? Some people are saying that you're a prophet. Some people are saying that you're Moses or Elijah." And he says, "That's fine. But now what about you? Who do you say I am?" It's called the confession, right? Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Christ. You are from God." It's huge. And Jesus says, "Well, you know that because my Father in heaven revealed that to you," right? But if you read on after the confession, something really interesting happens. For the first time in the story of Jesus and the disciples, Jesus plainly begins to describe what it's going to mean for him to be Messiah. And he tells them, "Hey, listen, I'm going to die, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to rise again from the dead." Now, this concept of a Jewish Messiah who is going to be beaten, who would suffer and die, had no place in the Jewish mind. Because for the Jewish mind, the Messiah would come in glory, lead the people in a revolt, and rescue the people in power and glory. And so when the disciples hear this, they're thinking, this doesn't add up. And look what happens. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's a title he uses for himself, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And look at this. "And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him." Isn't that interesting? You know what rebuke means? Basically, Peter says, "Jesus, come here a second. All right, Jesus, let me tell you something. You have this wrong, right? The Messiah does not suffer and die." Which is very interesting, right? Think about all Jesus has revealed about himself. But then after this confession, Peter's like, that doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. So he pulls Jesus aside. Now the scriptures say, after this moment, 6 days later, Jesus brings them up on the mountain. And they have this moment on the mountain, right, that we just talked about. But you know what happens? on the way down from the mountain, they begin to have the conversation about Messiah again. But this time, they're not rebuking Jesus. It looks different. Look how the conversation changes after this moment of awe. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. Okay, so you see the change, right? Same concept, death and resurrection of the Messiah. A week earlier, they're rebuking Jesus. After the Transfiguration, after they see Jesus in his glory, what are they doing? They're not saying, okay, yeah, we believe it now, but what does it mean? When Peter rebuked Jesus the first time, you know what Jesus said to him? He said, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God. You have in mind the things of this world." You know what awe is meant to do in our lives? It takes us from a human perspective, from what we see, and awe moves us to a place where we can begin to see things from a God perspective. See that? And on top of that, as we saw in the text, what happens? Faith increased dramatically, didn't it? With the disciples. It's a very beautiful thing. See, that's one of the reasons God gave us awe, right? So that we would be a people who have a changed perspective. And God knows this. We've all heard this before. The longest distance to travel is the distance between like the head and the heart, right? We can understand the truth of God. And, for example, one of the truths of God, it says that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. In other words, if you are God's child, no matter what the circumstances, God is using it for your good because he loves you, right? We can have that in our head, but so often it doesn't make it to our heart. But when we learn to stand in awe of God, all of a sudden those things begin to take a real life inside of us. I mean, just think about that, right? Sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes a relationship doesn't work out. Sometimes the plans that we have don't work out. And from a human perspective, right, what do we see? Like, man, God, why? It's kind of like Peter rebuking God. God, how could you do this in my life, right? I deserve this. All these things, we can do the same thing with God. But then when we actually step back and put ourselves, right, in the presence of an awesome God, we can stop rebuking God and saying, all right, God, you love me. This is your plan. And then start to say, instead, what does it mean for me? One of the things that kicked off this series for me that really got me aimed towards awe, I was actually reading a book about pastoral ministry. And he told this story in the book, and I'm just going to read it to you, and we'll end with this story, but I think it's a great one. Sharing a story about a friend who became an avid rose gardener, okay? His rose garden was the community's most beautiful and healthy and with the widest variety of roses. He did everything humanly possible to prune, protect, nourish his bushes into maximum health and productivity. During the season, he would work many hours every day on his bushes. He did it with discipline and perseverance. He told himself he did it because he loved roses. He didn't mind the early mornings or the gardening that took him into the night. His wife thought he was a little nuts, and his friends wondered what it was about those roses that hooked this guy. But nothing seemed to weaken his resolve. He knew the website of all the most important rosebush sites. He was friends with all the good nursery owners in the area, and he had filled his head with endless trivia about the history, health, and care of roses. Carl, maybe this story's about you. He was able to speak in a rose lingo that needed translation if the listener himself was not a roser. One Friday evening, after 3 hours of rose work, he was looking out the window as he washed his hands in the kitchen sink. And it struck him all of a sudden that one of the things he hadn't done in years was to enjoy the roses. He had studied the world of roses. He had cultivated the soil around his rose bushes. He had carefully pruned his bushes, and he had given bunches of roses to others. He had fed and watered his roses. He had long discussions with others about his roses. He had spent time at the local nurseries learning and examining every rose bush to purchase. He had become, listen, he had become an expert in roses. But he had not been moved or changed by the display of beauty that was the object of all his efforts. That evening, as he stood at his sink, he determined he would do what he hadn't taken the time to do. He would enjoy his roses. Maybe that's where the phrase, take time and smell the roses, came from. The next morning, he decided to get up and go out and sit in his rose garden in front of the objects of his work. But this time, he wouldn't work. He would sit, watch, listen, and enjoy. And so before noon, he placed himself in front of one of his bushes, and for hours he just sat there. He noticed how every branch of each bush was unique. He noticed the individual curvature and placement of each thorn. He watched the insect civilization that attached itself to each bud. He noticed the contrast between the new growth and the old growth. He was awestruck by the precise and delicate architecture of each blossom. He couldn't believe how each yellow petal wasn't really one shade of yellow, but actually was a wash of 100 different yellows crossing all over the plant. He told me that it may seem weird to say, but his hours before that bush changed him. Those hours gave him back his sight. They made him thankful. They made him smile at the level of his heart. They filled him with mystery and joy, and most importantly, they caused him to worship. Love that. If you're here this morning, let me ask you a question. Are you in a place, are you living with your eyes wide open? Are you learning to appreciate the incredible God of this universe who's placed all of this at our fingertips with one purpose, that you would know him? To tell you what, when I found myself going through the motions of life, I was way more discouraged. I became hopeless sometimes. But when I read this, right? And I said, you know what, God, I'm going to make a point to be in awe of you again and to appreciate you. It's just absolutely incredible, without even trying, how God has changed and grown my perspective and how he's teaching me to be able to see things from his point of view. It's one of the most beautiful things. Amen. And that's, of course, what I want for us today. Maybe your eyes are completely shut and you need to leave here with your eyes open. If that's you, praise God. Maybe you're pretty used to seeing the work of God around you, and I hope that you would just continue to embrace that. But as we go through the series, right, I thought it would be fun. God is at work in all of our lives, right? And the things that put me in awe may not be the same things that put you in awe, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you are in awe about mathematics like I am, but that's okay, because God has wired us uniquely to experience the world the way he's called us to do it. And throughout the series, I would like to be able to share as a community the moments in our lives of awe that God has given. So when you came in this morning, you have a sheet in front of you. If you go ahead and grab that sheet, put it in your lap. We put pens and pencils around. I know that some of you bring your own, and maybe you already did this. But as we come together, we're going to have communion here in just a few moments. Worship team, could you guys come on up? You guys could come on up and get ready. For communion today, we're going to sing 3 songs together. But for the first, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your sheet, and I just want you to be quiet and think about a moment of awe that you've had in your life. I want you to write on that piece of paper, okay? You don't have to put your name on it, but if you want to, I'd love to see who it came from. And then throughout the series, as we just talk about awe, I'm just going to be grabbing some of these, and I will just share about the experiences that God has given us in the community. Does that sound good? Very cool. Our kids should be here in a second, so maybe just wait. Yeah, it might take a while. So, worship team, could we do this? Could you guys just sing one song here? And then let's reflect, listen to the song, and just write on your paper what God brings to your mind. And then after this song, we'll come together and have communion with the kids.